Hello everyone. So in this video, we're going to get started with the design part of web design. You already know the rules of HTML and CSS that allow you to create content, but now we're going to look at how small choices that we make can have a huge impact on our user perception. We're going to look at a simple example derived from print media, and then we're going to start talking in this video about Gestalt theory and how we can use principles from psychology to inform our web design. So if we look at our website, one simple example that we have of changing user perception is what is called the fold. So this term, the fold, actually comes from print newspapers. Back when print newspapers were the main way that people received the news, journalists had a huge amount of pressure to make their stories really pop and seem interesting and draw in readers. In general, people tend to make very snap judgments about whether or not something is worth their time. And for a print newspaper, the way that we actually used to purchase these things was by putting all of the newspapers in a news box. In this box, you would stick a couple quarters in the top, and that would let you pull down the door and pull out the newspaper. In order to save space, the newspapers were folded up in this box, but what this created was a small window of content that was actually visible, and that was the only thing that people could read when they were making the decision of whether or not to buy the paper. So what this small section at the top of the paper came to be known as is the fold in journalism. So the discussion was always, well, what content should appear above the fold? And usually what was prioritized here were striking images, people in commanding poses, or other photography that really drew in the eye, as well as snappy headlines, taglines that really implied a lot more than the stories ended up saying. And if we look right here on this newspaper, that's pretty much what we've got. We've got two images, one that is someone that's standing there looking very commanding. We've got just a couple headlines, not even close to everything this newspaper would cover. There are no cartoons on here. There's no sports headline because sports was not the biggest news that week. Nothing in entertainment. So there's a lot of material that just isn't even mentioned on the homepage or on the fold in our newspaper here. There might be indicators of sections. There are little cutouts that say, hey, go to this page for this story, or there might be an even listing of the categories of news along a bar on top. But the little cover that users have before they decide whether or not to read this paper is very focused. Everything that's placed there is placed intentionally, and space is given to those few things. It's not like we're trying to cram as much in as possible. So on websites, these same rules apply. Someone is going to click on your homepage and they're not going to scroll all the way down. They're not going to read through the entire thing before they decide whether or not they want to actually read your website. You pretty much have the amount of space that is open when the browser is first open to have your users decide, have them really commit to engaging with your platform. So that is our fold. And if you hear the term fold used in web design, normally we're talking about that initial frame of content. And the recommendations are exactly the same as they are in print journalism. If you want to make effective use of this space, you want large banner images that use a lot of color, that set the tone for your website. You want headers, big bold text with catchy taglines, things that in just a phrase or a sentence explain the purpose of this website or kind of bait the user into wanting to read more. You might have some unobtrusive navigation. You might have something that kind of gives them a concept of the structure of your website and helps them know what they will find, maybe start organizing their brain. But you're not trying to fit your entire website on your homepage. You're just linking out to the other things that are available. And the important thing here is remember responsive design. Whether someone is viewing from a laptop or a 32-inch monitor or a TV or a phone that fits in their pocket, every single one of those has a slightly different fold. So we actually have a harder problem than newspapers had. We need to make sure that our design responds and that material that's visible on the homepage is roughly analogous for all these different form factors. So that's the idea of the fold. And what I want to look at now are two examples of news sites and compare how they use the fold. On the left here, we've got CNN, and CNN is really trying to cram a lot into this web page. We've got a 3-column layout, and there are stories in each of these columns. The one on the left is very slightly bigger, but honestly, I can't tell. If I were picking one headline, I think all 3 of these look like they're taking up about the same amount of space. There is no visual hierarchy here. There's just everything crammed in as much as they can fit, hoping that something will catch your eye. So now compare this to AP News here on the right. With AP News, we still have 3 columns of content, but those columns are structured slightly differently. If we look at this entire front section here is dedicated to just one story. There's a large image front and center taking up about 1/3 of the whole visible page, and this image is specifically for the content directly to its left, and that text flows all the way down. This is our headline of this webpage. If I had to say what is the most important news right now, I'm going to pick that story that's front and center like that. I'm not overwhelmed with everything that's going on, but they do have the same number of stories as CNN. CNN has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we can see the start of 6. Here we can see 1, and then down on this right sidebar, this is where they put all of their non-headlines that link out to other parts of their webpage. And we've got a 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and 6th right here along the sidebar. So I would say if I were judging and evaluating these 2 websites, this news site on the right makes a much more effective use of the fold. It doesn't feel nearly as busy and overwhelming as the site on the left, even though they're showing the same amount of content. And this is just one simple example of how the decisions you make, like the divs and spans and headers, are virtually identical between these 2. But this styling can have a huge impact on your perception of the website. There are some things that they do the same. We can see they both have a section, a list navbar up along the top of all the other types of content. The US news, the politics news, the sports, the entertainment, the health, the science. So you can navigate effectively to any other part of the website. But that first impression is hugely important. It is the difference between someone reading more and maybe feeling overwhelmed and just clicking away, not being sure even what they're supposed to focus on. So that is our first little example of web design there. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about Gestalt theory. So humans generally are hardwired to look for patterns and try to find the whole from the parts. Back when psychology was first taking off, becoming a rigorous social science, there were a couple psychologists who were really interested in studying how humans perceive and process information around them. What this led to was a theory that the whole is sort of greater than the sum of its parts. That's what that word Gestalt means. And as a great example of this, look at this painting right here. So this painting has no lines at all. There are only splotches of shadow and light. However, if we look at this for any length of time, especially if we make it a little bit larger, we start to see something in these splotches. If I'm looking at this, I see it looks sort of like a dog here. There's his face sniffing in the dirt. Here's his shoulder and back. In the front, we've got these two little legs here, and then a belly and two hind legs. And that's not all. If I keep looking at this, this looks to me sort of like the shadow of a tree or maybe a small little pond. There's a tree trunk up and down here. Maybe a pile of leaves or flowers in the corner. And not everyone is going to resolve this image in the same way. But very few people are going to stare at this for more than a couple seconds and say, yeah, it's nothing but blotches. In fact, if someone does say that, it can even be indicative of a processing problem with their mind. And this right here is an example of how we don't necessarily even need to call everything out. In our design, we can use these Gestalt rules of how our brain processes information to inform our decisions and figure out how to style things to sort of guide users one way or another. So there is a lot of text about Gestalt theory. It's been around 100 years now, so I can't possibly cover all of it, but I'm going to highlight two examples for you. Our first example is going to be hierarchy. So hierarchy is really important for organizing information. We like to schematize things into groups, say here's a broad category and here's points under it. And the brain is constantly doing this when it visually processes new information. Look at this image right here. On this image, I've got two shapes. If I asked you which is the more important shape in this image, I'm going to bet pretty much everyone would pick this circle on the left. When we are organizing content, things that take up more space or use brighter colors are naturally going to feel more important to a user. So what this means for us when we are designing our website is that we should really reserve large sizes and bright colors for headers, for important figures, or for any other focal point content, things where we're trying to guide the eye, because someone naturally wants to look at the biggest thing. It's almost like a survival instinct. We have to take care around anything larger. If we go back and look at our news website here, and we're looking at their effective use of space, the biggest thing on the page is this banner image, this figure for the main headline story. So that to me feels like the most important thing. That's what I'm going to concentrate on most of all. Likewise, if we look at color and we say there's a budget of color, there's a certain amount of attention, and so we have a certain amount of things to give attention to. Color is one effective way of spending that attention budget and forcing people to pay attention to things. So we've got our main story and our kind of side story, both very colorful images. The logo of the Associated Press here also has that bright red to sort of guide the eye up there. And of course, the donate button is bright red. We were thinking about, well, what are the priorities for this organization? The news that they're presenting is their biggest priority. And so that is the biggest thing, the most colorful, eye-catching thing. And getting money so that they can keep doing their work, apparently also very important for them. I keep staring at that donate button because it is so brightly colored up here. That is an example of how by just tweaking colors a little bit or making things larger, smaller, we can emphasize or de-emphasize them. If someone were just scanning our web page, they'd probably read, look at the logo, look at the donate button, look at the headline article there, and maybe just skim through the rest. So if there is something that definitely needs to be read, you're going to want to make sure it's large, it's bold, it's taking up that space in the visual design. So that is how we can control hierarchy. We can also use Gestalt theory to inform grouping. So as an example here, say I've got this image and I asked you, how many groups are there in the dots below? Most people would probably say, I see 2 groups, one group with 3 columns, one group with 2 columns. There are no lines here, but by putting a gap, we've created a natural grouping. People want to put things together when they're close to each other. This principle of closeness is one of the big ways that we resolve images. If we go back to our Dalmatian photo here, all of these little dots right here, especially around the head and the front leg, that really feels like a group. And that's what kind of helps us resolve the whole animal. Same thing, this large black mess of dots up in the top left corner. This feels like a group. And that's how we start trying to recognize, well, what is this shape here? If we take this principle, this observation of how the eye works, and we apply it to the web, we can again come away with some interesting conclusions. If we go and look at the AP News page here, if I asked you, where does the first story end? Pretty much everyone will be able to tell. There's this gap of 2 or 3 lines of text. It's not even that much space, but this little gutter on the bottom gives you a nice clean break and says, okay, well, this is the first story, and then here's the start of the second story below. In the same way, there's a small little gutter here. There is no hard line. There's just a gap of space, and that helps separate this sidebar of content from the main content area. We don't always need hard lines, and that is a big mistake that newer developers tend to make. Is you've got your main content area, so you put a thick border around the main content area. You've got 5 menu options, so there's a hard border around each of the 5 menu options. If we go up and look at this little website that we're clicking through here, there are almost no hard lines on this page, but still, it's very obvious that these 5 phrases here are some type of grouping together. We go and look at the main content area, and we can do something like put a single colorful little block along one side, a just one-sided border, and that's enough to create this division of space and make it so all of this content feels like one area. Very, very rarely do we want a bunch of rigid lines, because we can leave it implied and get the same effect with much less of our color and space budget used up on just presentational divisions. So that is the big takeaway for grouping, is that sometimes less is more, and if you're trying to create a group, it can be enough to just create a little bit of space rather than always needing hard lines. As I mentioned before, there are more Gestalt rules that are definitely worth looking into. Some of them get really complex, a little bit more than we would tend to do in a website, but there's a lot of material there that can really help you inform your design. So in this video, we've just scratched the surface of some changes we can make to our designs to help guide our users. We looked at traditional journalism and the fold and how principles like the fold apply to websites. We've introduced Gestalt theory, talked about how perceptually we tend to look for wholes rather than parts, and seen 2 ways we can do that with hierarchy and the use of space and color, and with grouping through the use of space. So from here, we have a lot more material to cover, other lenses we can use to view our websites. I look forward to that, and I will catch you all in the next video.